The Essex Boys and Mr. X by Heath Mayfield from Visual Feast Publishing. Nipper Ellis did own up to his actions regarding the Tucker and Tate incidents, but the deal had been done and dusted. Nipper knew that he had immunity from any prosecution of charges relating to the matters that he would own up to. Nipper had kept his part of the deal, therefore he was not charged and arraigned for what he had admitted to, and never at any point did he mention the existence of Mr. X. A very significant fact, that is, Tate had insulted Billy Blundell by arrogantly disrespecting him regarding Billy's efforts to help resolve matters. It did appear that Tucker had contemporaneously ignored the invitation of a friendly sit-down with Billy to try to help sort out problems. So much so that it was being viewed as the ultimate insult by many, and being offed for it would come as no surprise. But when advised by Billy Blundell that he did not have to kill Tate, the killer could just shoot him, or both of them, Tate and Tucker, in the groin, therefore leaving them alive and still responsible for any monies owed to Mr. X, which he could then collect. The killer was infuriated at the suggestion and had responded that he would not do that. Money owed him appeared to mean nothing to him. He said that he could soon replace the owed money, but he could not abide Tucker and Tate any longer, as the Blundell's family pride and reputation were on the line, and he fully intended to kill them both to preserve the family's standing, including their sycophant wannabe gopher, Rolf, if need be, or anyone else that may be present with them at the time. Did Billy Blundell sense any sort of deeper reasoning for Mr. X wanting to kill Tate and Tucker? He did seem to be personally somehow overly bothered with the continued existence of Tate and Tucker. Was there more a personal reason? Billy Blundell has never commented publicly on the possibility. There was never any need for a second shooter, as there was indeed only one shotgun used in the attack. Whether it had to be reloaded mattered not. It was planned to be an act of extreme prejudice and malice, but not overly rushed when executed, a terrifying experience for anyone to have witnessed, and is an example to others who thought they were beyond punishable retribution, with obvious clarity. Again, did Nichols drive a different hitman rather than Holmes to the scene? In his evidence, Nichols said that talk or conversation was minimal on the way to the ambush scene. Was this because Nichols was previously told not to ask any questions concerning the activity and not to inquire as to the killer's identity? Even if he already knew the killer's identity or suspected it, or the people who condoned his intentions to take care of the matter, merely to drive and wait, then to take two men away from the scene, supposedly including Mick Steele after the slayings. Was the real shooter the one who tried to fit the false number plates to the VW, only to find that they could not fit the fake plates because of the wet weather? This fact was something that Jack Holmes was aware of, and therefore would not have bothered trying in the first place. Was Jack Holmes merely attending a broken down car owned by Nichols at the time in the Basildon area on the request for help by Steele to try to keep Jack out of the frame? Was Jack Holmes' telephone call to Nichols as innocent as he says it was, simply to let him know that Jack had fixed the car and it was ready to pick up? Was Nichols' story about driving into the country laneway initially to turn around and drop off Jack Holmes, plus to have returned to pick up Jack and Mick, a load of rubbish? There was no distinct footprints or tracks found leading down the laneway leading to the locked gate. Did Nichols actually drive the killer to an accessible entry to the trail running adjacent to the ambush track, so as not to leave any distinguishable tyre prints or individual footprints, or even oil droppings from the VW car that had a significant oil leak bound to leave traces? Footprints, cigarette ends, chocolate wrappers, who knows what, in or on the actual ambush track. The high bushy laneway area next to and closely adjacent to the ambush track was overlooked or discounted by the police as a possible avenue for forensic investigation. There were many footprints found at the gated scene, but most had been attributed to different groups of shooters that have visited the area on a regular basis for shooting purposes. Then there were the footprints left by the farmers, who have said to have originally discovered the bodies of the dead men. Later, untold police investigators and photographers stomping all over the place. The whole crime scene had been disturbed and contaminated. The only useful factual evidence left on hand were several spent shotgun cartridge shells. There were also no distinct footprints or distinguishable so-called new Wellington boot footprints worn by Steele and Worms, as professed by Nichols so vividly, left leading from the Range Rover and back up the ambush track to where Nichols professed to have been waiting and picked up Steele and Worms, but leaving no tyre tracks or oil leak spills to indicate that a vehicle had been present. Again, did they leave the area via a small maze of tracks and rat runs that lead around the farms and fields leading back to close to the town? Even the most novice of criminals knows to check for alternative routes of escape from a crime scene. Alternative escape routes were never considered or investigated by the police. Was Nichols' story about leaving the scene and waiting elsewhere a load of rubbish also? Was he there, only metres from the ambush, waiting in the dark, merely to witness firsthand the killings, and not far from the parked VW in the adjacent thickly bush-lined track, watching or listening to the proceedings? Close enough for him to have witnessed some of the shotgun fire flashes, and witnessing McSteele and the shooter haul and lumber Tucker slowly and difficultly back into the Range Rover, which might explain the blood that Nichols said he witnessed on McSteele's gloves when he entered the VW for the escape. Did he not mention blood seen on Jack Worm's hands or gloves, and blood or tissue splashes on Jack Worm's jacket? How could he? Especially if Jack was not there, as there would have had to have been if Jack Worms had been the man standing outside the Range Rover firing, and he'd been standing close enough to Pat Tate when he's supposed to have blasted Tate in the top rear of his head or huddled against the back door of the car, naturally exploding and disappearing some of the contents of Tate's head in the direction of the shooter's upper body like a mist, or a spray of blood and biological tissue or material in the process and onto the shooter. Did the actual shootings take place in a cold, calculated and deeply personal and spiteful manner, and not a half-assed, rushed and panicked in a clumsy, amateurish way? Right from the offset, Nichols admitted that he'd never had the bottle to actually kill anybody. He could assist in a murder, but only as an accomplice and not the actual killer. Old Nichols could certainly condone the murders of others, but he could not personally commit the act. In truth, neither could McSteele nor Jack Worms. Nothing in their psychiatric assessments point or indicate that would have a psychopathic personality. Nothing that would appear in the psychological makeup of a sadistic, vengeful, spiteful and determined killer, as assumed the shooter was by many. Nichols was fully aware of what the legal ramifications of being part of a conspiracy to murder were. He knew that he would be just as guilty as any other accused of his role in the murder via conspiracy, as it takes two or more persons to constitute a conspiracy. Plus, he would have had to be informed or reminded of this fact specifically by Steele, that Nichols would be as guilty as Steele. So his involvement was as a willing conspirator. Therefore, he would have been reminded to keep this fact in mind should he ever speak of the murders, even if the threat of being offed by the real killer or other interested parties did not deter him. After the murders, Nichols tried to distance himself from Steele and Worms, but Darren Nichols always had it in his mind to deliberately try and distance himself from any responsibility in the killings by placing it squarely upon the shoulders of Steele and Worms when first questioned by the police, and denying any prior knowledge of what was planned by Steele and Worms. He professed and was allowed to plead that he'd been duped into being a driver one evening by Steele and Worms to take them to a drug meeting, no more. A cockamamie yarn was told by Nichols of a supposed drug hijack concerning a light plane and a reported 4 kilograms of cocaine. They had coincidentally obtained a machine gun from a criminal friend of theirs, but this was purely to add dramatics to his tale. He spoke of Mick Steele, who was a licensed pilot and was supposed to fly some people in a secluded field in the Basildon area, carrying a massive stash of cocaine. Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, who was a mere assistant, as being Tucker and Tate's driver and gopher, but he was still going to receive a large drink for his cooperation. This is why he was aware of what was to happen and was to take place at the scene. What has to be kept in mind is that in reality, it would take a considerable amount of side lighting to make a landing track for any light plane to use. It would need to be transported to a supposed landing field. What is the likelihood of the trio having in their possession such a bulky and noticeable mound of such equipment? Or could they arrange to borrow such equipment that would be necessary? The chances in either case are minimal. Plus, the unmistakable fact being, how on earth would Mick Steele explain that they had been hijacked and robbed without him being left on the floor dead with the consignment handlers? It is doubtful indeed this fantasy of Nichols was ever on the cards. Once again, Nichols has just been fanciful and imaginative, but may have been persuaded the people responsible for writing the screenplay for the movie to suck it up, as it made for a good plot and dramatic viewing. Nichols had declared that he had been coached heavily by the police on what evidence he was to give in the upcoming trial, especially concerning times, as they wanted Nichols' evidence coincided with timed telephone calls made by or received by Steele and Wombs on the eve of the murders. He even made mention of the number of times that the police had pointed out glaring differences and contradictions in his various statements, and he would then rectify them with answers to better suit his evidence. The police were said to be highly sceptical of Nichols' denial of being a knowing, willing accessory in the murders, but to secure a conviction against Steele and Wombs, they were prepared to play along with Nichols, conveniently giving him the benefit of the doubt, as they had no other collaborating or forensic evidence to rely on against Steele and Wombs in the prosecution of their case. When the Range Rover had finally arrived at the gated location, Rolfe had stopped the vehicle quite short of the locked gate, as he did not know which way it opened, inwards or outwards towards the car. So he left the room so he did not have to reverse if the gate opened towards him. He kept his foot on the brake the whole time. Moments only had passed when Mick Steele was said to have opened the rear passenger door and alighted from the vehicle, plus telling those inside to stay in the warm, as he would unlock the gate to allow them entry into the field that they would be operating in, at the same time conducting their perceived planned Motso drug transaction. Here, they were supposed to wait until the arrival of the cocaine shipment plane. Steele specifically left the rear door open as he walked past the seated Rolfe at the wheel of the vehicle, so as the occupants could keep him in their vision. Tate had moved into a more central position of the rear seat, so he could view the goings-on outside with Steele, plus with him leaning slightly through the gap between the passenger and the driver's seat, with his hands on the rear of the front seats close to the headrests. It took Steele a few moments to reach the locked fence, wearing a pair of gloves in the process, and to move as if to unlock the padlock. At the same time, this action gained the full attention of the trio inside the vehicle. The shooter, said to be Jack Wombs, was hiding in wait and had made his way closer to the car and stood at the open rear door of the Range Rover at an angle so as Tate could not see him in his peripheral vision at this stage. And then he fired a single barrel blast of his shotgun directly through part of the driver's headrest and into Rolfe's head at the rear right-hand side, immobilising him instantly. And then it is said that Jack Wombs then murdered both Tucker and Tate in that order. Now let us consider a more centralised and focused analysis of the facts that are known and deemed to be correct. That is, allowing for and accepting that there is in existence a British national criminal organisation that is referred to as the Untouchables, a ruthless and all-powerful combination of corrupt officers in various government, police, military and criminal circles, departments and organisations that cannot be dismantled, similar in a sense as the American CIA. As when taken into consideration a statement made by an Australian former serving police commissioner, John Avery, when he declared and stressed that unfortunately any police force does not run on clean hands alone when faced with police department accusations of corruption. What was the real motive behind the Rettendon murders, and who was the actual shooter? The following explanation regarding the killings is for you, the listener, to consider, and maybe to imagine, if you will, that you're a member of a jury that is sitting hearing the case with the following arguments and suggestions put forward, keeping in mind that doubt is doubt and it cannot permit or condone the returning of a guilty verdict. The following explanation put to you is taken from the belief that Jack Holmes was not the shooter or one of the shooters in the Rettendon murders, as there is no direct evidence to indicate that he ever was, either physical or forensic as in DNA, only a record of a phone call that he had made to Darren Nichols, but not revealing the contents of the phone call. There may have well been a phone call from Jack Holmes' phone, but once again the contents could not be revealed. It may very well be a case of Nichols revealing Jack Holmes' call to inform Nichols that his broken down car had been repaired and was ready for pickup, but purely on the word of an extremely questionable police informer professing to be the key witness to the murders to save off any conviction in a serious criminal offence that he may be accused of that may lead to a very lengthy prison sentence. You have been expected to accept the prosecution evidence that the professed or suggested content of the phone calls was to imply knowledge and involvement in the murders on Jack Holmes' behalf. It is made clear to the jury just what sort of character that Darren Nichols is. The judge informs the jury that Nichols does have a personal motive to give evidence in this case that may be of value or benefit to him, this falling short of saying that he may have been promised immunity from prosecution and inducements for him to give evidence in this case. Now please have the patience and open mindedness to consider the following explanation as to the motive and drive behind the killings of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. As if presented by an astute and tenacious defence counsel during this theoretical presentation, whose overall explanation is as follows. At a time of public outcry regarding the death of teenager Leah Betts, there was an awful lot of pressure brought to bear concerning specific individuals who could be considered somewhat to be connected to the drug-induced death of the teenager. One such person will be referred to throughout as Mr. X, a man who is known to be an intelligent person, individually very wealthy, and a criminal venture financier. A known dangerous criminal and being extremely vindictive and unforgiving to the point of murder. His real name cannot be divulged. This omission is to offset any legal proceedings for perceived defamation or slander, as this person is still alive today. He remains connected, protected and dangerous. He is most certainly not a fictional character. Mr. X was undoubtedly known as a significant player and financier in the local crime scene in Essex. Not only is he a well-known villain, but is reported to be a close family relative, or at least a trusted close friend, by the Blundell brothers Billy and Eddie. Keeping in mind that there are numerous members of the Blundell clan with different surnames, but housed under one roof, housed under the Blundell name. He was already versed and personally experienced when it came to murder, and was well acquainted with the trio of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. He had conducted business with them on various occasions, but not all to Mr. X's satisfaction. Although there was a time before Pat Tate had spun out through the massive intake of drugs that he was consuming continuously and his paranoid panic, Tate had always had a sound reputation of paying back loans he had taken from various criminal financiers, Billy and Eddie Blundell and Mr. X to name two, including their loans to Tate for the disastrous marijuana deal that went wrong. It had come to the stage that Tate had gotten into such a mental state that he threw all caution to the wind, declaring that no one was going to get paid back. This crazy decision had bothered Tony Tucker, as it was commonly known that whatever Tate was involved in, that Tucker would be required. So when Tate had borrowed drug finance money, it would be assumed that Tucker was responsible for half of it. Therefore, any retribution taken against Tate would automatically be taken against Tucker. It had been said that Tony Tucker blanked Billy Blundell as far as joining him in a friendly sit-down through arrogance, contempt and disrespect, but in reality it was because he was terrified of the possible consequences that could be waiting for both Tate and himself for failing to come good with the paying back of the loans and the interest accrued on them that Tate had arranged for the messed up drug shipment. He may well have been wary of Billy and Eddie Blundell, still he was terrified of Mr. X and his well-known penchant for exploding into a murderous rage at any given moment, and who well may be present at the sit-down. This issue had been a factor in the sour relationship between Tucker and Tate. Just prior to the murders, it was reported that Tucker had started to act a little bit different in his otherwise unshakable self-opinion that he was a dominant Mr. Somebody. Did Tucker want to stay out of the usual limelight and spend more time at home with his moody attitude and seemingly annoyed at Tate for some reason, as told by Tucker's partner later? When the incident leading to Leah Betts' death occurred, there was an initial rumour that it was Mr. X's supply of ecstasy that he was providing locally to the regular drug dealers that was the source responsible for the teenager's death. This news had infuriated Mr. X, as he was aware that it was not one of his bulk drugs buying recipients that had handed the ecstasy to Leah Betts, but a runner of Tucker and Tate's. As Mr. X was a semi-regular visitor to Raquel's nightclub under the supposed guise of being an innocent party-goer. He was at the time a young enough man so not as to look out of place in a trendy young nightclub. He was probably mistaken as to be one of the owners keeping an eye on the venue. Mr. X had already deduced the ecstasy that Leah Betts ingested had been sourced from or supplied by Tucker and Tate, who was known to be shabby, threatening, treacherous and uncaring in their dealings. It was not until the news broke regarding Leah Betts' condition that Mr. X was approached by one of his regular contacts who had cried financing for their criminal endeavours. As they revealed to Mr. X that a young drug runner of his had informed him that he had recalled seeing Leah Betts on the day of her birthday out on the streets, and it was in his discussion with her as to the availability of ecstasy. It was at this point that a known runner of Tucker and Tate, well known to Mr. X's young runner, had hijacked the conversation and had persuaded Leah Betts to purchase the ecstasy that he had been selling at a discounted price to Mr. X's runner. They were confirming to Mr. X that it was Tucker and Tate's ecstasy that was responsible for Leah Betts' condition. The tab from the batch of ecstasy that Leah Betts had consumed was said to be an awfully lot stronger than the ecstasy that was usually available. It was of relatively pure quality. Tucker and Tate were well aware of this warning by their initial supplier, but had chosen to ignore it or any consequence that it may bring for their unexpecting consumer. Money alone was their concern, not anyone else's health or safety. It had been so strong that Leah Betts had consumed an incredible 11 pints of water while dancing rapturously to the music, believing she was okay, as she was remembering to drink plenty of water so to keep hydrated while sweating away. However, this was a common misconception on behalf of ecstasy consumers. She was not visiting the toilet to dispose of the excess water, and therefore her liver and her kidneys started to fail, and would not process the water until the effects of the over intake of water caused by the thirst. But she did not recognise the excessive hyperhydrogenation that she was suffering from, plus the chemical changes taking place within her body. The overload of water had started to swell her brain before eventually collapsing her. What was to unfold then was the initial plan for a personally justified act of retribution administered upon Tucker and Tate on Mr. X's behalf. That would be via a plan formulated by Mr. X, and then affirmative action regarding that plan would take place and be administrated personally by Mr. X. His mantra was, if you're going to kill somebody, do not tell them. He was not about to murder the trio on behalf of Leah Betts. It was purely on the grounds of unacceptable arrogance and disrespect, plus money owed. At least that was the excuse that was given by Mr. X to those in the know. Mr. X was not having any of this. There were unwritten rules to obey. The unconcerned and the callous attitude being shown by Tucker and Tate as to any other human being indeed vexed Mr. X, along with the fact that Mr. X was very well connected and did not want any sort of association of involvement made against him or any close associates of his who were regarded as reliable, careful and accountable villains. Plus there was a possibility, but unknown and unintended personal involvement of Mr. X in the suspected murder of a young drug runner who was operating on behalf of Tucker after they accused him of ripping them off regarding their drug profits. Mr. X had inadvertently given Tate a loan to buy some drugs that were eventually to make up the concoction that eventually led to a young man's death via Tucker and Rolfe. At the same time, Pat Tate was languishing in prison for a time for breaking the rules of his parole. Who had administrated the young man with a fatal concoction of drugs they then injected him with, not once but on 2 occasions during the assault on the young fellow. They were then laughing at the deceased young man's death by giggling as if it was a random joke before dumping the young man's lifeless body in a local ditch. This matter, Mr. X certainly did not want to be implicated in any way. He also despised Pat Tate personally at this stage. He regarded him as a drastic waster and is what many have come to see him as. An extremely treacherous, volatile, belligerent, disrespectful oath, and was insistent on using extreme gratuitous violence, not to mention Tate's rough and cowardly violent treatment of women. Mr. X was certainly not alone in this thinking. It was odd considering that Tate and Tucker had both been responsible, well-behaved and respectable schoolboys. It can be said that they were average students and showed little sign at the time of turning into what they had become. Drug-soaked and haphazardly trying to live life as if it were a Hollywood gangster movie, with them playing imaginary movie roles such as characters in Scarface and such like. They were at a stage of delusion, imagined grandeur, a loss of rational thinking and actions, and more. Yes, suffering delusions of grandeur and power with carefree abandon.